Hey everyone, how you doing? Today we're going to talk to Tanner Lindsay about TanStack Router, formerly known as React Location, and we also talk about TanStack Table and TanStack Virtualized. All of these have React variants and other variants in different frameworks. We're going to go over the source code for those today. So we were talking about the changes you made to strip the. I'm also curious about the plugin stripping, but I kind of have an idea. I'm assuming it's to reduce all the internal calls that people are making through the plugins and now allow them to get access to it from the user land part of React table.
Yeah, so essentially like V7 had these plugins where, first of all, V7 was like not TypeScript. So it's just JavaScript, junky land, like do whatever the heck you want. And that's why plugins worked great. You don't have to type a plugin, you can just do anything with it. You can like alter things at runtime to do really tricky stuff when, it's just JavaScript. You can really get weird. And that's kind of what plugins were doing. Like they were giving people the power to hook into like the very low level internals of React table and change things. That made the internal system honestly kind of unstable. Like it's possible to change things that would severely break your tables. People built plugins anyway because they're very powerful. So instead of plugins like providing like a bad API interface, they were hard to type, almost impossible to type, to be honest. And they kind of gave too much of a foot gun and not enough accurate control. I decided to ditch the plugin API and re-implement a lot of the ability to do things that the plugins were doing, but with composition instead. So plugin might have been adding specific props to a certain call in a React table. Instead of adding that plugin to do those props, you would just kind of wrap the use React table hook with your own stuff and do that in your own templating functions. A lot of it comes back to just inverting that control back to the user at the point where they use the use table hook. And so far, so good. I haven't really had very many complaints. Even GitHub is like looking at migrating from V7 to V8 for like all their new issue tracker table stuff that they've built.
How was the decision to make it less prescriptive and more customizable? What drove that decision? I can understand maybe from a standpoint of like, oh, okay, this is better to do it this way, but what drove it in the sense that you actually made the changes and you didn't just, ditch React table altogether and you wanted to keep up with it? So instead of React table doing a lot of stuff for you, now you're having to do a few things more to implement with React table, but it adds more integration points.
Yeah, I talked about this a little bit. I had a talk that I did in React Summit that I did just a few weeks ago. It's called 5 years of React table or something like that. 5 years of building React table. But I talk about this where it was doing so much with the markup and like building the entire table for you. It was great as like a drop-in solution, but then basically you're only happy the moment that you drop it in, you're super happy. Oh, wow, it works. It's great. And then like the entire time after that, you're just stuck like trying to customize something that you can't customize because it's doing everything for you. So initially it was like, oh, wow, this is the greatest tool. And then it was like, oh, I have to fight this thing for the rest of my life.
If I was drawing this graphically, it would be like, it has like a big thing and then it goes right back down. Whereas now it's like more exponential. It takes a little bit to get going, but then it comes up right after.
Right. And it keeps going because you'll continue to have control. Right. So with the previous versions, like, there were props for everything, like to control markup, to control class names and props and, rearrange markup. Like I think in my talk, I said there were 130 something odd props that I had added to like the React table component, and like stripping those away and just doing a hook and saying you do all this on your own. The number of options went down drastically to like, 40 or 50 or something. And they were just options. Wow. So like a lot of issues in GitHub were coming from that too. Like people would be like, how can I move the pagination? And I'm like, oh, really? So then I had to like add an option to say like, oh, here's how to move the pagination. And then I'm like, it's just markup, And now like, so I get to like close all of those issues, basically tell everybody the same thing. If you want to do that, then you just do it. And they're like, what? I'm like, you own the markup, so you just do it. You do whatever.
So I'm assuming there's like a pagination component now that you just put inside of React table, or you put it in yourself, and then how do you get access to the data? Is there a hook now?
Yeah, I mean, there's not even a hook. It's just you call use table, you get back a table object, and that table object gives you everything you need to build it. Like you'll have the pagination state, the handlers, the updaters, everything.
Now, how'd you make that performant? Because typically getting a hook like that would, anytime any piece of the table has some change to it, the hook would fire for every consumer.
It does.
Oh, okay. Did it end up being like a performance issue, or is like something you're looking at, or?
No, because if you think about it, there's nothing stopping you from saying like use table. And even if use table was like super performant, components only re-rendered when they needed to or whatever, then it's nothing stopping you from sticking another hook in there that you're updating all the time. They're both going to trigger your table component to re-render. And unless you've done any like opting out of re-rendering, any props that have changed going down and, or children and down into that component are also going to re-render too. it just re-render down into the universe unless you opt out. Like the thing I like to tell people is like React is not reactive in the traditional sense. Like it doesn't have observables and it's not based on like, it doesn't have a digest cycle. It doesn't use signals like solid, and doesn't have like some crazy compiler. Like how is React reactive? And when it comes down to it, React is like a top-down memoization pipeline. That's all it is. You're just running over and over, right? And at any point in your entire component tree, if you want to know if something has changed and update it in the DOM, you have to fire off those render functions.
Yeah.
If render functions have to fire, or nothing will get updated, right? It doesn't mean that they have to do a bunch of work and like repaint, reconcile and repaint the DOM and do a bunch of stuff, but they at least have to fire. And so when people are like, well, it's making my table re-render every time I change this thing. And it's like, well, it's because you're changing something that could affect the entire table. So you want that. But like I'm showing 100 rows with, 10 columns. So that's 1,000 cells. So my cell components are firing 1,000 times and they're re-rendering. And I'm like, well, stop rendering 100 rows. Make your cell component faster. If you're doing something in your cell component that's intense, put a use memo in front of it and try and get it to be faster. Do less, virtualize. Like it would be no different if somebody just said, if they're doing the table and they render like 1,000 cells and they're like, it's slow. And I'm like, okay, remove the table and just make a loop for 1,000 items and just render your component 1,000 times in the same thing. Like it's not a table, just loop through and run it 1,000 times. It'll be just as slow.
Yeah. I've had problems, especially without concurrent mode. You can't get that kind of performance out of React typically.
So it's not really React table. It's you are trying to render too much on the screen at one time, and tables are a multiplier on top of that. You've got rows and columns and you can quickly get yourself into trouble if you're not being performant. But it all comes back to you control the components, you control the rendering. So if your components are slow, it's your fault. If you're rendering too much, it's your fault. And if you want to fix any of those things, you can, because you control all of it.
Yeah, so I'm wondering if there's even more you can take through this, is that you could use the observable pattern and then basically, not you necessarily, but somebody could build this, or even you could build it where the cell itself has some kind of identifier to it, like a name, and then you could pass that to a hook, and then that hook would just subscribe you to the updates for that one cell's information.
And you could do it. You could do it with anything that can bypass like React and context and, use sync external store hook. You could easily do that. You could take all the cell information, pass it into like context object and supply that down the tree. Every single individual cell that you're rendering, just subscribe to like that context value. Probably wouldn't be too different than just making your cells faster. If you're going to do that, then you might as well just memo, like react.memo your cell component and just get really strict. These are the only props I'm passing in. And if this changes, then re-render this item. And that gets hard because, you get strict dependencies on your components. And then now all of a sudden you're in the other end of the spectrum where you're like, I changed this thing, but my component's not updating. And it's like, oh, it's because you put React memo on it. So it's a spectrum, but the whole point between all this is that you remain in control of all of that. If you want to get really granular, you can. Out of the box, I don't think you really need to. Like I'm showing on some of my dashboard screens, I have, 5 or 6 tables. Each of them have 10, 20 rows and maybe 5 or 6 columns visible at a time. And as long as your components are fast rendering those cells, it's not very difficult to re-render all those tables. So
interesting. Yeah, I can see where people would have issue with the latest version. I know that a lot of people don't use hooks in their React components, and so they have a lot of unnecessary re-renders of things, and that would probably cause a lot of performance issues. So I can see where people are coming from, but I can also see where you're coming from too, where you're trying to make sure that they have the tools necessary to build what they need, because everybody's going to have different needs for their tables. And something even like pagination, like you were saying, that's math. That's not something where you need to control it and set it up. That's something that they could do themselves. They need to figure out, how they want to paginate, how many they want to show, how many total items are even in the table. Like you can give them that information, but then they could build what they need with it.
Right. And pagination interfaces vary wildly. Everybody has their own pagination interface, including me. So
yeah, that's interesting. I didn't think about it like that, but that does make sense. To give them the tools that they need, they can build their own table, and that's more beneficial to people than trying to prescriptively determine how a table would be built. You could still build the old one, the old React query. If let's say somebody was on the old one and they needed to convert over or something like that, you could still build the old one off of the new tech because it's more headless.
Yeah, you could. Thought about doing that, but it's not something I want to maintain.
Yeah, for sure.
Because again, just like date pickers or, any interface like UI design and anything, it all ends up being so different every single time. Every component, why do you think so many design systems and component libraries exist out there? Is because one person has some differing opinion on how something should look or behave. And it's like, you got to build an entirely new library. You can't support every use case and also have a UI library at the same time.
Yeah. I'm also under the impression that the Vue is cheap. So this might be, I don't know, you might share this opinion, but I think of the state as in logic as the most important piece. And as long as that's transferable, you can use it anywhere. And then the Vue is cheap. You can redo the views. You can change your feature flags, whatever you need to make the views look different. But the logic is what's most important. And that's what you need to test and make sure is working properly. You can build 50 paginations if you have the right logic that's going to be consistent between all of them.
Yeah. And how many UI component libraries out there that already have that built?
Yeah.
I want a pagination component. I want a table. Like you can hook React table or Vue table, whatever it is. You can hook it up to anything you want. Like there's a guy who's been helping me with React tables. His name's Kevin Ghadyani, and he's building a project called Material UI Table or Moo. I can't remember.
MUI Material UI. That's the shorthand.
Yeah, but it's not like the actual official Material UI project. It's like this. It's just a data grid, but it's built using React table, and then it uses Material Design UI components. So you can just kind of attach it onto anything you want. You can build your own or you can attach it to stuff. And I completely agree. Like the Vue is cheap and it changes way more often than the logic ever will. The logic is hopefully you design it once and it just kind of works. And that's how tables work. So, but the layout's going to change and the colors are going to change. And, I don't need anybody banging down my door, in the middle of the night on GitHub, like, hey, we just decided to revamp our entire UI. How do I change this thing in React table? And I'm just like, I'm sleeping. Goodbye.
Yeah.
So hooks are great and headless hooks are even better. And that's why, if I don't have to, I'm never going to design another markup driven component if I don't have to. The only one that I have that's still very markup driven is React charts.
Well, I mean, you could probably do something with it too, but the problem is the rendering output requires a library. That's what people want is the chart output.
And writing headless chart markup is not something normal people want to do, not even developers. So I just don't think that, it would be very useful to do that.
It's like, so you want to use a canvas and then you want to loop through this thing and then put the Yeah,
I've thought about it. There's definitely some room to explore there. Maybe not going framework agnostic, but definitely making it headless, like a two-piece library. So you have the headless stuff, but then I'm also shipping components in React for you to wire up to those things. And you have the control where you want it logically. Then the components you can just kind of feed in from a library and compose them a little bit easier. I don't know.
Yeah, see, that's an idea that I could go for. It would also remove the need for something like D3. You're essentially building a D3-like thing, but you're separating the markup part from the logic.
Yeah. Charts are one of those things too, where people don't want to customize the large parts of a chart. They usually just want to find a chart type and then customize small things about it. Somebody says, well, I want a bar chart. They don't want to go in and actually render the bars, but they do want to be able to determine the exact props that are going onto those bars and render things around them, like put a title on top of the bar or a number or whatever. Hooking into the render lifecycle is way more important than someone wanting to re-implement the plotting logic in a column chart,
Yeah. Is React virtual for windowing?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, we should talk about that too, because I think it's related. In the React location, I'd really like to look at too, because I've done a lot of router, but I haven't done, I don't even know what market we're targeting with React location. It seems like a neat.
Yeah, let's talk about it. Third one here. So headless UI for virtualizing large element lists. If you've ever done windowing, it's like a windowing library. Do you ever use React Window or React Virtualized?
I think, yes, yeah, it's React Virtualized and React Window are the two. I've also written my own windowing with the intersection observer. And yeah.
Brian Vaughn's great. He builds some fantastic stuff. Definitely took some of his API into consideration when I built this. Obviously, it had to be headless. So that's kind of the big differentiator. I don't even know of another headless virtualizing library there yet. So I'm pretty sure this is the first one. Maybe not. Anyways, it's headless. And that's really awesome because virtualizing, you're like, well, what am I rendering with virtualizing? Actually, let's go over to React Window really quick, compare and contrast the API here. So if we look at React Windows example, they have stuff like this, where you're importing components like auto sizer, you're importing a fixed size list, you're importing fixed size list. Let's see, you're passing components to that fixed size list. So it's very component driven, here's the website. So this is what it looks like. So you're rendering this fixed size list right here as list, and then you have to pass the component in as row. So it's very component driven, right? But like, what is this list rendering? Like, you don't know what any of this is actually rendering. You know what I mean? If we come in with our dev tools and check this out, like, okay, so basic list style. Okay, so here's the window that is windowing on. So here's the one that's really big, right? And then the items inside it. So this is very standard windowing, right? You have the small scrollable one that's kind of going up and down. You have the big one that's got the manual height on it of 35,000 pixels. And then you have all these individual like little things in here that are, you know, absolutely positioned and just basically being translated around. So as you scroll down this list, you know, you can see those kind of going in. Right. But that's the thing is you didn't render it that way. You just rendered list. So what if you want to change this div? What if you want to change the outer div? What if you don't want to, like, here you have this style here, how to apply the style. What if you wanted to do some like custom translations or styles on these outer wrapping components? Like, this is just one example, but usually when you get into virtualization, there's not just this tactic, but there's also a tactic for creating. Actually, I'll just show you. Let's go to React's table and go to the examples. So this is a cool one. It's using a table element. So tell me the last time you saw a table element that was virtualized. Like, usually you have to use divs and you have to use these like custom wrapper things, but check this out. We've got a table, t-head, tr. Okay, get down to the T body. Check this out. In the T body,
virtualized rows.map. Oh, I see what we're doing. Okay.
It's syntactically correct here. We've got T body, and then we're returning TRs, and then we're returning TDs. Like, where's the wrapper, right? There's no wrapper here because it has to be syntactically correct for tables. So how the heck is this doing? Well, it turns out we're taking the padding top that we determined from the virtualizer. Like, how far down on the virtualizer are we? We're creating a fake TR row and adding a height to it that is padding the top and the bottom of this virtualizer right here.
That padding is based on the scroll distance.
Exactly.
Yeah. But this is cool. So I never thought of doing this, and I've never seen this myself either, that you've got a regular table and now you're virtualizing it. Like you said, you normally do divs. With the table, you have the header and the body and you can't virtualize it correctly. But you've set up a way to virtualize it by using this. It's not fake padding, but by basically only showing a certain number of items and then addressing the distance you've scrolled based on, that's your padding now.
Right. So if we come down to, so let's just scroll down the table, watch the T body. Like, yeah, these rows are coming in and out, right? But there's one of them at the top that's sticking around, if you noticed it. Even when we scroll up.
Oh, yeah.
Right,
that's
here.
The padding?
So let's check out the padding. And as we scroll up and down, you'll notice padding is just changing dynamically to make sure that we, like, let's just cruise down the page. Oh, cow. We're getting into like,
wow. Yeah,
really big numbers. That's freaking awesome. There's also a padding on the bottom too, to make sure that you have like the remaining height available. So then when we're up top, you know, it's the reverse pad of the window. So as we get near down the bottom, you'll see it just kind of goes away. Looking at it this way, right? How would you do that with React window? Like, they would have to ship a custom component to do that, you know?
Yeah, something that can take a table and then like somehow mutate the top and bottom of it and allow for two yields in their sections that you could put in.
Yeah, so they have like fixed size, variable size, fixed size, variable size grid. Like, they've got all these different variations, which is funny. Like, if you want to make a grid with TanStack Virtual, you just put two virtualizers together. So you have a y-axis virtualizer and an x-axis virtualizer, right? And you put them together and use them together to like make that. So that's kind of why like virtual is super powerful. It also like does dynamic stuff really easily. So when it comes to like measuring things, some of this stuff can change based on how it's rendered. So like, if you're rendering content that is different, like you don't know how big that content's going to be inside of a virtualizer, you have to measure it and then update the virtualizer with the measured value.
Yeah, so that's what I've done. So how did you do it?
Yeah, it's kind of the same way. The implementation is really easy though. So the difference between a dynamic virtualizer and a non-dynamic virtualizer, there's no different options. All the options are exactly the same. The only difference is that when you get down to your item, all you do is take the virtual row that you have and you put the measure element. You just call the measure element function with the element. So in React's case, it's just
that's the top one that you were talking about. When you say measured element, what's that? Do you mean that's the outer element? That's the one that's outside?
Yeah. So we're taking like the virtualized row that we're getting back from the virtual items, and it has this method on it called measure element, where we're essentially taking the element and just passing it to measure element. So calling measure element with the outer element after it's been rendered will update the virtualizer with the actual height of that item. so that you can just gradually opt into dynamically sized elements as really pretty cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's the toughest part for sure. Yeah, I'm a little confused by it, but I get it, but I'm not quite sure.
So here's like the grid virtualizer. We got a row virtualizer and a column virtualizer, just two of them put together. And we're estimating that the size of these boxes will be around 125 pixels, but that's just what they render as the first time, right? As soon as they render, we are going down here to the actual cell. So we're going over our rows and then we're looping over our column virtualizers. And then this ref, we get the ref, which has the element, and then we're just passing the element to the measurement functions for the row and the virtual column. And we get dynamically sized columns and cells.
Wow, I wish I would have used this when I did my image gallery viewer app a while back. This would have been a lot simpler than having to write my own. And it does all the same stuff, but because it's headless, it's much easier to use. There's less, hard-coded stuff that I had to do just to make mine work for my use case.
Yeah, like the headless thing is really great. So
yeah, in fact, I'm seeing this pattern, right? That everything being headless is super nice. Whenever I'm looking for libraries, one of the things I'm always looking for is this going to get in my way? And I often look for something that's more customizable, that allows me to build what I need, because the business is going to ask for something and then I'm not going to be able to develop it. And so I need to have that power. And what you're doing here with these headless stacks allows the consumer to have that kind of power that they need to actually get their work done. And like you said before with React Table, it was so good when you first put it in. And then as you started using it, that's when the frustration started coming in, because now you're actually trying to get something done. Business is asking you to do this, put the pagination here, change this functionality. And now you can't do anything because it didn't have the power to do that.
Exactly. Headless all the way really is what I'm trying to get at. Like React Ranger is going to move headless soon. We have some awesome work on that. React Charts probably will never go headless. I don't know. We kind of touched on that. So React Location, it's a router. Yes, there's another one. Because React Router is really big. React Router is used by so many people that use React. So it's kind of like a big competitor. I needed to make sure that there was a way that I could differentiate React Location. And it wasn't that I was just building React Location because I wanted to build a router. There's a big story to have around React Location. Could take a while to talk about, but essentially I started with React Router in Nozzle and build around React Router as much as possible, and found myself wanting additional APIs around the way that links behaved, and around the way search parameters behaved mostly, and just wanted more control, and especially over typing too. I built it around React Router for the longest time. I was running a wrapper around React Router. Every single export the React Router was exporting, I was proxying and wrapping up with my own custom logic. And it worked for a really long time until I got to the point where I needed access to the internal stuff of React Router, the context. I needed to extend it beyond its current abilities. And I stretched it too far and just broke. I didn't have access to the stuff that I needed. And, they're on their own little trajectory, right? They're going into Remix, and they're going into a lot of arenas and places that I don't necessarily care about for this library and wanted to go. And they definitely did not want to entertain my ideas for adding in those APIs. Some of them would be breaking. Some of them are very advanced and powerful, could be foot guns. And, for better or worse, they didn't even really recognize the use cases I had for it as viable use cases, even though I was able to, kind of show them hey, look, these are the use cases. And they're just kind of oh yeah, okay, that's a use case, but it's not a very big one. And I'm all right, whatever, that's fine. I'm going to go build this library, and they kind of questioned why I would be building a library, and couldn't really see the differences. Maybe they still don't, and that's fine. I'm not looking to take over a React Router or anything, I just needed something that was going to get the job done for Nozzle. And so a lot of that stuff revolved around the search params APIs that I need, and being able to update search parameters in a way that was going to be scalable into a large system. With Nozzle, we have lots of different dashboards. Every single widget in the dashboard holds its state inside of the URL. And that state needs to be able to be serialized and deserialized out of the URL on a whim. It needs to be stable, referentially stable when it's being serialized in and out of that URL. It has to be duplicated in a deep way that is a duplicate, and structurally shared is the word that I'm looking looking for. So it uses structural sharing to make sure that, even though you're storing serialized state in a string location, that when you bring it back out, it's not triggering unnecessary effects.
Oh, so it's something like you could put your own JSON processor in there, like Super JSON or anything else that can process a map or a set.
You could do all of that if you wanted. The other thing that, you can do is, so right here, like say you wanted a link that was only going to change the search parameters for your page, nothing else. If you wanted to bring in all the old search parameters and just pass the new ones, then you would have to deserialize all these search parameters outside of a use search hook, bring all the old ones in and only modify the ones that you wanted. Everywhere you wanted to do that, you would have to use that hook or create your own custom component to do that. Where like the APIs around React Location are very functional. Like here's the search and you just say, I'm changing the search. Give me the old search that's currently there and let me modify it in some way and then just return it like in this little function. And that's how you update the search.
It's a reducer.
Yeah, it's basically a reducer. And if you look at that link, like it's going to produce actual ahref with the search updated, so you can command click that if you wanted, right? But it's using a functional reducer to do that. There's another one in here too, where, so right here, this link is interesting because I'm looping over these and I'm saying, I'm going to link to these right here. And they're going into this too. The search is interesting because you can just pass true. And if you pass true to search, it just keeps the search wherever you are. So you could legit just do this. You're like, hey, I'm linking to a new place. I don't want to change the search params at all. I just want to keep them. So you can just keep the search by just saying, hey, just keep it.
It's the same thing as returning the old search.
Yeah. It's the same thing as doing this basically.
Yeah.
So there's that. In this right here, to and search, if you wanted to change those at the same time in something like React-Router or just any other router, you would have to generate the string for that and put it in the path and the search. And it's a lot of work to do that, but this is all split up so that you can actually generate links to both of them. Like you can do both of them at the same time or just one of them or just the other. And you don't have to worry about splitting up and doing different, like having to maintain all this string stuff. Like nobody likes string manipulation.
That's the problem I ran into. I was working on a side project. I needed to keep it consistent between all these different routes. And the only other option was to just have a single route other than doing all the string processing. So what you have here is it makes query strings a first-class citizen.
Yeah. So let's look at this right here. If we let's just go through this app really quickly. If we click down here into dashboard and then we go to users, you'll notice here that we have default search param coming in up here. Even when I hover over users right here, there is a default search param that's showing up on that link that has this users view. And that's serialized JSON right there. There's nothing in there yet. But if I click on one of these users, that's great. Right. But normally, if I wasn't doing what React Location's doing, if I were to change this over to like sort by email, right? So now it's sorting by email. But if you were just to come and generate one of these links, I want to go down and find this actual. So right here, this is the link that's for each one of these people right here. Do you notice anything interesting about this link?
It doesn't have anything about search.
You're right. But if I hover over these links, I don't know if you can see in the bottom left hand of my screen.
Oh, I can see it.
There's definitely search information there, right?
Yes.
And I'm not even passing search true.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering.
So it's like, how is this working? Because the way that it would normally work is if you changed the ID or the email and then you went and clicked on one of these people, this would switch back to name.
Yes. You would lose all your search information unless you manually
all your search information.
moved it. Yeah.
So what we can do in React Location is teach our routes how to maintain very specific search param information. So if we come up here to our route declarations, we're going to go down to the route definition for users, which we're inside of invoices. We're inside of users. And then there's this, there's the path, the element, the loader. All this is pretty standard. Here's the children for the sub route, for the individual user. But search filters, this is something that it's awesome. So basically we have these search filters where we want to keep the user's view search param while it's in this route or any of its children. So as long as we are inside of this route, we want to manipulate some of the search parameters and keep them around or clean them up or do whatever. So all it is just a couple of functions that you can have in here that say, give me the old search. We're going to pass in the old search, whatever it was, and we're going to add in the user's view, and then we're going to add in whatever the user's view was. So this is why when we come up to invoices and then click on users, there's a default user's view because we're trying to bring it over. Nothing's there, so it just kind of is empty. Then when we click on Kelsey Diedrich, and then we sort by email, and then we come up here and click on Jenna Reichert, right? The Glenna Reichert link doesn't have anything about search, but we are persisting it. When we click on that, this is getting run for the link generation, not just the click, but the link that it generates with Ahref under the hood. These search filters are getting run for all of the contextual links being generated within this route or to that route. So you get to keep that information around. It's extremely powerful. It's basically the same thing as being able to define search filters right up here as like use state. Search filters are going to be tied to a specific route, and they're always going to stick around as long as you're inside it. And if we link outside it, it just goes away. We click the back button, we go right back to where we were.
Oh man, that's nice. Yeah, and not having to manage it is a lot easier.
Yeah. Search filters are amazing. In the latest version of search filters, there's pre and post search filters where you can do some things like before the link is generated, I want you to do this with the search filters. After the user has run their own search function, I want to do some post search filter cleanup and clean some things up. So you have a lot of control over all of the search params, including what you were talking about, where you can actually pass custom serializers to React location. Like one of those right here that I'll show you. There's a JS URL search param plugin that will use JS URL ranked routes. You can do route elements, route plus route elements to route. So you can basically affect the search params however you want. Anyways, all of like the asynchronous stuff, like the loaders and, you know, the things that like that stuff that I saw as low hanging fruit. You know, Next.js has all the get server side prop stuff. Remix iterated on that API really well and brought in the loader concept to the, you know, to files. And now, you know, React Router, they're bringing this loader concept to React Router in like the next version, which is super good for them. Like that's awesome. It wasn't necessarily something as I saw like as a defining difference between React location and React Router, because I knew that they were probably going to bring that into React Router eventually. But it did seem like kind of like table stakes, something that I should just bring in. And, you know, all the loader logic and async logic, it wasn't too difficult. I built React Query, which is tons of asynchronous stuff and just managing all that terrible state. It was a lot of fun to build that stuff in there. Basically, what I've told people is that if all you want is React Router, but with loaders, then just wait for the new version of React Router to come out that has loaders, you know, and you're going to be very happy. Simple migration path. But if you're somebody who wants to have like very tight and explicit control over search params that, you know, it's very easy, in my opinion, to bump up against the ceiling on the search params API inside of React Router. The best answer they have to it is just to create a custom hook that wraps around, you know, use search params or whatever and do it that way. And to me, like, in my opinion, that's just not robust enough for any applications that are really working in a granular way with search parameters. So that's mostly why React location exists. Will it go headless or agnostic in the future? I don't know, maybe.
Yeah, that's cool. Now, it also gives me a good view into why you built it, because I had only used React Router, but hadn't run into the issues I thought you were going to talk about. But now that I see it, I have run into the same issues, especially with the search, anything with filtering, or even where you're trying to like make a Google Maps or something like that. You typically need a query string that needs to be manipulated in there. You're not just going to use a bunch of paths. So this makes a lot of sense. It's a great utility for when you need it.
Yeah, like this show notes right here.
Oh yeah, it's an app state, and we're representing that in the query string.
Yeah, like normally you'd be like, oh, show notes, like I can just use state for that. But instead of doing that, we're just pulling in the search from use search. And then we are pulling in to see if we have any notes inside of it and setting the notes. If anything, you know, changes in the notes, then we are just replacing the state we put in there. So even the notes themselves, if you want, you can write them directly into like this text box and they get put up into the URL. And yeah, you can do that with any router. But the difference is how easy it is to do. This text area is bound to set notes. When set notes changes notes, we have an effect that is basically saying whenever notes changes, we're going to navigate. Here's our search function. Pass the old notes. If we have notes, we're going to replace them. And then we do a replace true. That way it doesn't kill our forward, backward history. And if we close our notes, all those notes are still there, we just haven't. So
this is instead of having to use local storage now, you can use the URL and then you can send it between devices and sync it that way.
exactly.
Oh,
So
that's
in
cool.
my opinion, if something can live in the URL, it should. Like, I don't see why it shouldn't.
Yeah, well, that's something I never considered. I've considered the URL as state, but not like this. This is taking it to the next level for sure.
Yeah, this is like microscopic state, it's like, oh, should it be a use state? And it's like, well, do you want it to die every time you refresh the page? And if the answer is yes, then use use state. And if the answer is no, then you put it in the URL.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, oh my goodness. So then if you were doing this pattern of putting state into the query string, you'll want to use a library like React Location, or one that allows this kind of better search routing.
It's not that you can't do it with React Router, it just, if all you're doing is storing 1 or 2 flat search parameters up in your URL, it'll work fine. I do it all the time in Remix and React Router, and it's totally fine. It's when you start getting complex shapes and objects and wanting to put them into the URL and manipulate them and move them around and, be able to make fine-grained updates and control to, parts of that highly nested and complex state that's living in your URL. Same thing with a use state. I could make a comparison. React Router search param support is like use state. It's very shallow. It's very simple.
Oh, I see. A specific piece of it, but it's not the whole thing. Like, it almost reminds me of set state or something like that, where you'd have the object and you'd have to maintain that.
Then imagine getting into even deeper tools where it's like, oh, I state on this really large thing or a reducer that I want to run on my code. That's where use state isn't going to work very well anymore. You need something better. It's the same thing with React Location. Like, usually like, oh, I'm going to add immer, or I'm going to add, some tool to help me manage my deep state. That's what React Location is for the URL. It's like deep state URL search param stuff. So
I really appreciate talking to you and the time you spent with it.
Thanks for having me on. It's been fun. I love talking about like the internals of things. It's not like a lot of it's high level, you talk with people, but it's fun to get into the internals and talk about demos and code.
Hope you enjoyed that code conversation with Tanner Lindsay. You can follow him on Twitter at Tanner Lindsay, and you can also follow me on Twitter at Sautedos. And if you have any feedback, I'd appreciate hearing it, good or bad. I do respond to every YouTube comment, and I do respond to tweets. So I appreciate your time. Please like the video if you liked it, and subscribe if you want to see more. There are going to be more interesting topics to come. Thank you very much. Goodbye.